The opulent chandelier in the grand foyer of the Hargrave mansion cast a warm, almost regal glow over the marble floors as the night of the anticipated event began. It was a night that would mark not just the celebration of Matthew Hargrave's 28th birthday, but also the convergence of ambition, love, and hidden motives. Victoria Hargrave, the formidable matriarch of the family, moved through the expansive halls with a commanding presence. At 55, her elegance was unrivaled. Clad in a deep blue silk gown that shimmered under the crystalline light, she held her chin high, every step deliberate. Victoria's gaze swept the room, assessing the guests already trickling in, from politicians to entertainment moguls. This was not just a party, it was a statement. In Pasadena, Emma Caldwell stood in front of her modest mirror, adjusting the neckline of her dress for the umpteenth time. The simple, yet elegant, emerald green gown had been chosen by her best friend, Lauren, who now sat cross-legged on the bed, observing Emma with an approving nod. "You look perfect," Lauren said, with a confident smile that Emma wished she could mirror. Emma's heart pounded. Tonight she would step into a world where every glance would be a judgment and every whispered word a potential critique. "Thanks, Lauren," Emma said, trying to push down the doubt gnawing at her. The invitation to Matthew's birthday party hadn't been an ordinary gesture. It was a test, a summons from Victoria herself, delivered with a smile that failed to reach her eyes. The tension between the two women had been palpable from their first meeting. Emma, with her warm brown eyes and expressive nature, stood in stark contrast to the poised, calculating Victoria, whose every move seemed to serve a purpose. A knock on the door interrupted Emma's spiraling thoughts. Matthew stood there, dressed in a tailored black tuxedo that highlighted his broad shoulders and easy smile. The sight of him was enough to calm the storm inside her, even if just a little. "You ready?" he asked softly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. His eyes were kind, searching her face for any sign of doubt. "I think so," Emma replied, taking a deep breath. She glanced at Lauren, who gave her an encouraging thumbs up before standing to leave them alone. Matthew cupped Emma's face gently, a gesture that spoke volumes about the depth of their relationship. "I know tonight will be tough, but just remember, I love you. Nothing my mother or anyone else thinks can change that." Emma felt her chest tighten with both love and apprehension. "I know," she whispered, feeling the reassurance she needed, but still carrying the weight of what was to come. She was stepping into the heart of the Hargrave Empire, where power and perception reigned supreme. The drive to Bel Air was lined with shadows cast by the flickering city lights. The luxury car hummed as it smoothly wound through the secluded hills. Matthew's hand held Emma's tightly, fingers interlaced, silently promising that they would face whatever the night brought together. Emma tried to focus on the familiar touch rather than the creeping anxiety that threatened to swallow her. As they approached the towering iron gates of the Hargrave mansion, the enormity of the event loomed before her. Inside, Victoria's sharp eyes caught sight of the sleek car as it pulled into the circular driveway. Her painted lips curved into a smile that hinted at satisfaction. She had crafted this evening to perfection, every detail meticulously planned to showcase not just the Hargrave wealth, but to underline Emma's perceived inadequacy in such surroundings. The guests mingled under the vaulted ceiling of the main hall, a symphony of laughter and soft classical music filling the space. Waiters in crisp uniforms weaved between clusters of attendees, balancing trays of champagne flutes and hors d'oeuvres that were as much a statement of luxury as the chandeliers overhead. As Matthew and Emma stepped into the mansion, the room stilled almost imperceptibly. Heads turned, conversations paused, and the collective gaze of the city's elites settled on them. Emma's pulse quickened, but she kept her chin up, meeting the eyes that tried to size her up with quiet defiance. "Matthew, darling." Victoria's voice cut through the ambient chatter as she strode forward, arms outstretched. She kissed her son on both cheeks before turning her attention to Emma. "And Emma, welcome," she said, her tone polished, lacking warmth. Emma managed a polite smile, hoping her trembling hands were not as visible as they felt. "Thank you for having me, Mrs. Hargrave," Emma replied, trying to match Victoria's grace. The older woman's gaze lingered a moment too long, as if appraising a work of art she had yet to determine the value of. Victoria led them further into the room, seamlessly guiding the conversation to include the high-profile guests, each introduction serving as a subtle reminder of Emma's outsider status. The orchestra played a soft, melodic tune as the evening progressed, and Emma felt the weight of countless eyes following her every move. Yet, beside her, Matthew's unwavering support acted as a lifeline in a sea of scrutiny. As the night unfolded, Emma found herself moving from one conversation to another, each encounter blending into the next with a practiced courtesy that masked the underlying tension. The guests were polite, some even charming, but their questions were veiled assessments. "And what is it that you do, dear?" an older woman in a gown encrusted with pearls asked, a polite smile stretched across her face. "I'm a literature teacher," Emma replied, her voice steady. The woman's eyebrows lifted slightly, a flicker of surprise, quickly hidden behind a mask of civility. "How lovely," the woman said, with just enough emphasis to make the word feel dismissive. Emma's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she stood firm. She reminded herself why she was there. For Matthew, not for the approval of these people. Nearby, Victoria watched the interaction, a glass of champagne in hand, her gaze unwavering. She noted the way Emma held herself, the way she responded to subtle barbs with quiet dignity. It was a quality Victoria grudgingly admired, though she would never admit it. Still, the evening was young, and she had orchestrated moments designed to test Emma's composure further. Matthew, ever observant, made his way back to Emma after being pulled into a conversation with an industry executive. He could sense her tension the moment he approached, the subtle stiffness in her posture. Slipping his arm around her waist, he leaned in. "You're doing great," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. Emma allowed herself a brief exhale, letting his presence bolster her. "Thank you," she replied softly, turning to meet his eyes, which sparkled with genuine affection. The gesture did not go unnoticed. Victoria's smile tightened, and she took a sip of her drink to hide the slight clench of her jaw. As the night progressed, the grand doors to the mansion's ballroom were swung open, revealing a space even more opulent than the hall. Crystal chandeliers cast intricate patterns on the polished floor, and an orchestra in the far corner played a waltz that resonated through the cavernous room. Guests began to move in pairs, gliding effortlessly as they joined the dance. Matthew turned to Emma, extending his hand. "May I have this dance?" The question was more than a simple invitation. It was a declaration in front of everyone watching that Emma belonged there with him. Emma hesitated for the briefest moment before placing her hand in his. They moved onto the floor, finding their rhythm as the music enveloped them. Matthew's touch was steady, guiding her through the steps with practiced ease. For a moment, the room and its watchful eyes melted away, leaving only the two of them in their own quiet world. Across the room, Victoria's eyes narrowed. This dance, this display of affection, was not part of her plan. She gestured to one of the servers, a discreet signal, and within moments a subtle commotion broke out near the main entrance. The noise drew attention, effectively breaking the spell that had settled over the dance floor. Emma and Matthew paused, looking toward the source of the disturbance. A man in a sharply tailored suit had arrived unannounced, his presence commanding immediate attention. His name was Richard Coleman, a well-known investor and former business partner of Matthew's late father. Coleman's arrival was unexpected, and Victoria's carefully composed expression slipped for a moment. The last time Coleman had stood in the Hargrave mansion, tensions had run high, resulting in a fracture in the relationship between him and Victoria. "Richard," Victoria said, moving toward him with a guarded smile. "What a surprise." Her tone was icy beneath the veneer of hospitality. "Victoria," Coleman replied, his eyes moving past her to where Matthew and Emma stood. His gaze lingered on Emma, a curious smile playing at the corner of his lips. "I see the party is as extravagant as ever. You always did know how to make an impression." "Indeed," Victoria said, barely containing her irritation. She knew that Coleman's presence would stir rumors among the guests. The timing couldn't have been worse. Matthew felt Emma stiffen beside him. "Who is that?" she asked in a low voice. "Richard Coleman," Matthew answered, a shadow crossing his features. He and my father used to work together, but things didn't end well. Be careful around him. Emma nodded, the ease of the moment fading as the night took on a sharper edge. Coleman's sudden appearance was more than just an uninvited guest. It was a reminder that the Hargrave family was not just marked by wealth, but by intricate and often ruthless alliances. The room's atmosphere shifted, the air thick with curiosity and unspoken questions. Richard Coleman's arrival was like a stone cast into still water, sending ripples through the crowd. Guests whispered behind raised glasses, eyes darting between Victoria, Richard, and the couple at the center of the ballroom. Emma could feel the weight of their stares pressing down on her, turning her presence into an unwanted spotlight. Victoria, ever the strategist, knew she had to regain control of the narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, raising her voice with a practiced poise that demanded attention. The room quieted instantly. "Please, continue to enjoy the night. We have a wonderful performance planned shortly." Richard's smile did not falter as Victoria moved past him, her eyes issuing a silent warning. He gave a subtle nod, acknowledging her unspoken message, but his attention was drawn back to Matthew and Emma. He approached them with a confident stride, the smile widening as he stopped just a step too close. "Matthew, it's been too long," Richard said, extending a hand. His eyes flicked to Emma. "And you must be the young lady I've heard so much about." Matthew shook Richard's hand, his expression a careful mix of politeness and caution. "Richard, it's unexpected seeing you here tonight." Richard chuckled, a low, knowing sound. "Life is full of surprises, isn't it? And I must say, I'm even more intrigued now that I've met your lovely companion." He turned to Emma, his gaze holding a hint of challenge. "Emma, is it? You're quite brave to be here tonight." Emma felt her pulse quicken, the backhanded compliment twisting like a knot in her stomach. "Thank you," she replied, meeting his gaze with as much steadiness as she could muster. She knew he was testing her, probing for a reaction. Matthew shifted, subtly positioning himself closer to Emma, his protective instinct apparent. "Emma is more than brave, Richard. She's remarkable." Richard's eyes sparkled with interest. "I can see that." He took a sip from a glass a server had handed him, eyes never leaving Emma. The Hargrave legacy, so intertwined with powerful alliances. "I wonder how it must feel stepping into such a role." Emma's smile remained frozen, her fingers tightening slightly in Matthew's grasp. "I think roles are what you make of them, Mr. Coleman," she said, a hint of steel in her voice. Victoria, watching from across the room, felt a surge of frustration. Emma was holding her own, not crumbling under pressure as she had anticipated. This wasn't part of the evening's plan. She needed to redirect the attention, and she needed to do it now. The orchestra reached a crescendo, signaling the transition to the night's main event. Victoria moved to the center of the room, raising her hands gracefully. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "This evening is not just a celebration of Matthew's birthday, but a celebration of legacy, resilience, and the future." Emma felt Matthew's hand tense, and she glanced at him, noting the shadow that passed over his expression. He knew his mother too well to believe her words were simply a toast. Victoria's eyes flicked to Emma, a brief pause that spoke volumes before she continued. "As we celebrate, it is also a reminder of the values that bind us, the alliances that have built not just fortunes but families. In that spirit, I'd like to invite my dear friend, Richard Coleman, to say a few words." Gasps rippled through the room, and Matthew's jaw clenched visibly. Emma felt her heart sink. This was Victoria's move, a power play disguised as a toast. Richard took the floor with a slight bow, the room now buzzing with anticipation. "Thank you, Victoria," he began smoothly. "It is a true pleasure to be here, especially to celebrate a young man who has shown promise, determination, and a sense of justice, much like his father." Emma's gaze darted to Matthew, who was unreadable, eyes locked on Richard with an intensity that bordered on defiance. "But it's not just bloodlines and tradition that sustain legacies," Richard continued, his voice deepening. "It's the people we choose to stand beside us, the challenges we face together, and the values we hold when no one is watching. There was a slight murmur among the guests, the undercurrent of suspicion mingling with curiosity. Emma felt exposed, like a character in a play where she didn't know her lines. Beside her, Matthew finally broke his silence. "Thank you, Richard," he said, stepping forward. The crowd's attention swung to him, his sudden move silencing the whispers. "Legacy is indeed built on choices, and I am proud of mine." He reached for Emma's hand, holding it high for all to see. "Emma is the choice I've made, not just for tonight, but for every day to come." A stunned silence fell over the room, eyes darting between Matthew, Emma, and the disapproving figure of Victoria, whose carefully crafted mask was slipping, revealing the storm behind her eyes. The silence that followed Matthew's declaration was almost palpable, stretching out like an invisible thread. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, every beat resounding in her ears. She glanced up at Matthew, whose eyes were resolute, his posture confident despite the storm brewing in the room. This was more than a statement of love. It was a public defiance of everything Victoria stood for. Victoria's fingers tightened around her champagne flute, the knuckles turning white. The finely tuned script she had prepared for the evening had just been shattered. The room buzzed back to life with whispered conversations and curious glances. Guests exchanged looks that ranged from amusement to shock, their expressions saying what their hushed voices did not. Victoria Hargrave had lost control of the narrative. Richard Coleman's smile widened, the corners of his mouth twisting into something that resembled both admiration and challenge. He raised his glass, eyes fixed on Matthew. "To choices, then," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. The guests hesitated, some lifting their glasses, others simply watching to see how Victoria would respond. Victoria took a step forward, her face composed but her eyes cold. "Indeed, to choices," she said, her voice tight. She looked at Emma, a flicker of something unreadable passing over her face before she turned back to the crowd, and to the resilience required to live with them. Emma's hand felt clammy in Matthew's, but she held on, grounding herself in his presence. She knew that Victoria's words were a warning, not just to her, but to anyone who dared challenge the expectations of the Hargrave name. The orchestra resumed, its melody weaving a fragile thread through the tension in the air. Some guests returned to dancing, others to mingling, though the energy in the room had shifted. Emma could feel the eyes on her, more curious now, more speculative. She could almost hear their thoughts, wondering if she was truly the woman Matthew would risk so much for. Matthew leaned in, his voice low. "Are you okay?" Emma nodded, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yes," she said, though the word felt heavy on her tongue. She wanted to be strong, for him, for them both, but the weight of the evening was beginning to take its toll. Victoria moved through the crowd like a queen among courtiers, her presence commanding attention. Every nod, every word exchanged was measured, her mind already working to salvage what she could from the evening. She stopped when she reached Richard, who watched her with an amused glint in his eye. "You seem to be enjoying yourself, Richard," Victoria said, her voice cool. "Immensely," he replied. "It's not every day one gets to witness a Hargrave gala with such unexpected developments." Victoria's smile was thin, more a baring of teeth than an expression of warmth. "Let's not forget, Richard, that the Hargrave legacy has weathered far worse than a moment of youthful defiance." Richard chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "Oh, I'm quite aware. But perhaps it's time you considered what legacy truly means, Victoria. It's more than control and appearances. Sometimes it's about adapting." She met his gaze, eyes narrowing. "I don't need lectures on adaptation from a man who abandoned loyalty the moment it ceased to serve him." "Loyalty is a two-way street," Richard said, his tone softening. "Just remember that before it's too late." Victoria turned sharply, the conversation leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. She had built her empire on loyalty, alliances, and unyielding will. But tonight, cracks were beginning to show, and Emma was at the center of it. Across the room, Emma found herself surrounded by a few guests who introduced themselves, each conversation more probing than the last. A tall man with salt and pepper hair leaned in, his tone conversational but sharp. "So, Miss Caldwell, How does a literature teacher find herself in such illustrious company? Emma kept her smile steady, though she felt the trap in the question. I suppose life has a way of surprising us all, doesn't it? She said, deflecting smoothly. But the man's eyes narrowed, not satisfied with her vague response. Indeed, he said, glancing pointedly at Matthew. Surprises can be revealing. Before the conversation could deepen, Matthew stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying an edge. Emma is here because she belongs here, just as much as anyone else. His gaze met the man's, unyielding. The man held Matthew's stare for a moment, then nodded once, as if acknowledging a boundary had been set. He stepped back, leaving Emma and Matthew alone for the first time in what felt like hours. Emma exhaled, the tension in her chest easing just a fraction. I don't know how much more of this I can take, Emma admitted, her voice a whisper. You're not alone in this, Matthew said, his eyes full of resolve. We'll face whatever comes next together. But even as he spoke, a subtle shift in the room's energy made them both turn. Victoria had stepped back into the center, raising her hand for silence once more. The guests fell quiet, anticipation crackling in the air. Tonight is about celebration, Victoria announced, a smile that didn't touch her eyes spreading across her face. But it is also about honoring traditions. So, in that spirit, I'd like to announce an unexpected addition to tonight's program, a dance, led by the Hargrave family. Emma felt her stomach drop as Victoria's eyes met hers. The challenge was clear. The orchestra's tune shifted seamlessly into a waltz, its haunting elegance filling the room. Emma's fingers tightened around Matthew's, and she felt the subtle tremor that ran through her. This was Victoria's next move, and everyone in the room could sense it. Guests whispered, their eyes darting between the poised matriarch and the couple at the center of it all. Will you dance with me? Matthew asked softly, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from him. He was determined to shield Emma, to show the room that she was not an outsider to be tested, but an equal, cherished by the man they all revered. Emma nodded, mustering a smile. Of course, she whispered, her heart hammering in her chest. Victoria moved like a queen onto the polished floor, her dress flowing behind her as she signaled the beginning of the dance. She extended her hand toward Richard Coleman, surprising many of the guests who had assumed she would dance with another member of the family or an old family friend. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly, but he took her hand with a grin that promised more than just a dance. This was a game to him, and he enjoyed every moment of it. Matthew led Emma onto the dance floor, and for a moment, the world shrank to just the two of them. The music guided their movements, and Emma focused on the rhythm. The way Matthew's hand felt against her back, warm and steady. They moved in unison, their steps graceful and practiced. But despite their synchronicity, Emma could feel the weight of eyes on them. Some approving, some critical, and others openly hostile. Victoria's eyes flitted to her son and his partner as she spun elegantly with Richard. You really do enjoy a bit of chaos, don't you? She murmured to him, her smile never faltering. Richard chuckled, the sound low. Only when it's earned. Your son has a backbone, Victoria. You should be proud. She narrowed her eyes at him, but his comment pierced through her resolve. Matthew had always been strong-willed, but tonight he was more defiant than ever, driven by a force she had underestimated, love. Emma, gliding across the floor, felt a surge of defiance rise in her. The whispers, the judgment, the piercing eyes, none of it mattered at that moment. She was here, with the man she loved, and she was not going to let anyone, not even Victoria, make her feel unworthy. As the dance continued, a sudden commotion at the edge of the room caught Emma's attention. Lauren, her best friend, had arrived. She stood near the entrance, her camera slung around her neck, eyes wide as she took in the scene. Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her at the sight of a familiar face. Lauren was her rock, the person who reminded her who she was when the world tried to tell her otherwise. Matthew noticed Emma's eyes brighten and followed her gaze. He smiled, nodding slightly in Lauren's direction. The gesture did not go unnoticed by Victoria, who felt the delicate balance of her evening slipping further out of her control. With a graceful turn, Victoria ended her dance with Richard and clapped her hands, signaling the conclusion of the performance. The guests responded with polite applause, some more genuine than others. Emma felt her pulse return to normal as the music quieted, the tension in the room dispersing slightly. Victoria stepped forward, her smile still in place but her eyes cold. "Now, let us continue this wonderful evening with an announcement," she said, her voice commanding. Matthew and Emma exchanged glances, a silent question passing between them. "As many of you know, this celebration is not just about my beloved son's birthday, but also about the future of the Hargrave family," Victoria said, her gaze sweeping the room before landing squarely on Emma. "Matthew has chosen a path that defies tradition, and while some may question it, it is a reminder that strength lies not just in blood, but in character." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Was this an olive branch or a veiled threat? Victoria continued, "Emma Caldwell, you have been at the heart of many conversations tonight." The guests shifted, the room holding its collective breath. "I must admit, I had my reservations. But tonight, I've seen something unexpected, a determination that, perhaps, even a Hargrave could admire." The statement hung in the air, heavy with implications. Some of the guests clapped hesitantly, unsure of where Victoria's words would lead. Emma felt a rush of emotions, relief tempered by the sharp edge of uncertainty. But before she could react, Richard spoke up, his voice cutting through the applause. "And isn't that what this family truly needs? A breath of fresh air, someone who reminds us of what it means to fight for what you believe in." Victoria's eyes darkened, and the room shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer about Emma alone. It was a battle of wills, a power struggle between the past and the present. Emma glanced at Matthew, who squeezed her hand gently, his expression one of unwavering support. "Indeed, Richard," Victoria said at last, her voice low, "but let us not forget that even fresh air can be a storm if unchecked." The murmur in the room grew louder, guests shifting and casting glances as the tension mounted. Emma felt like a spectator in her own life, the weight of Victoria's words pressing down on her chest. Beside her, Matthew stood taller, eyes fixed on his mother. He knew this game all too well. It was a dance of power that Victoria had mastered over the years, but tonight, he would not let her set the rhythm. "Mother," Matthew said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Tonight was meant to be a celebration, and I believe that's what we should return to." He stepped forward, drawing Emma with him, their joined hands a visible statement of unity. Victoria's smile barely faltered, but the muscles in her jaw tightened. "Of course, Matthew. Celebration it is." She turned to the guests, who watched with rapt attention. "Please, continue to enjoy yourselves." The orchestra resumed, and conversations picked up slowly as the guests exchanged looks filled with speculation. The tension did not dissolve, but it faded into the background noise of laughter and music. Emma felt the pressure ease slightly as Matthew led her to a quieter corner of the ballroom. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, eyes scanning her face for any sign of distress. Emma nodded, though the tightness in her chest hadn't entirely left. "I'm fine, just surprised." Matthew sighed, frustration darkening his features. "I didn't expect her to take it this far tonight." "It's okay, really," Emma said, placing a hand on his cheek. "We knew it wouldn't be easy." Matthew's eyes softened at her touch. "I wish it didn't have to be this hard." He paused, glancing at the crowd. "But I'm proud of you. You stood your ground, and I think more people noticed than you realize." Emma's gaze followed his, catching sight of Richard Coleman observing them from across the room. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her uneasy, as if he were piecing together a puzzle she didn't yet understand. Before she could dwell on it, Lauren appeared, her smile a welcome distraction. "There you are," Lauren said, enveloping Emma in a quick hug. "I couldn't let you face this crowd alone." Emma's laugh was genuine, the first one of the night. "Thank you for coming." Lauren glanced around, her sharp eyes taking in the opulence and tension with equal ease. "Quite the show, huh? I got some great shots from the entrance." The headline practically writes itself. "Teacher steals spotlight at Hargrave Gala." Matthew chuckled, the tension in his posture easing. Lauren, you never miss an opportunity. Hey, someone's gotta document history, Lauren teased, her tone light but her eyes serious as they flicked to Victoria, who was deep in conversation with a group of distinguished-looking guests. Before they could say more, Richard Coleman approached, his presence casting a subtle shadow over the trio. Lauren, always the sharp observer, he said with a nod before turning to Matthew and Emma. I didn't mean to intrude, but I wanted to offer my congratulations. Congratulations? Emma repeated, wary of the glint in his eye. Richard's smile was enigmatic. For handling tonight's challenges with grace. It's not easy to walk into a room like this and hold your own. His gaze shifted to Matthew. You've chosen well. The compliment, if it could be called that, left Emma unsure of how to respond. Matthew's expression remained guarded. Thank you, Richard, he said, his tone neutral. Richard nodded, his eyes locking with Emma's for a brief moment before he turned and melted back into the crowd. The interaction left a chill behind, a sense that something unseen was unfolding beneath the surface. Lauren leaned in, her voice low. What's his deal? Emma shook her head, still trying to process the moment. I don't know, but I feel like we're just pieces in a larger game. Matthew's eyes narrowed as he watched Richard disappear into the crowd, his jaw tightening. You're not wrong. We need to be careful. Before Emma could respond, Victoria's voice rang out, cutting through the noise once more. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me for a toast in the main hall. The guests gathered, glasses in hand, as Victoria stood at the head of the room, her posture regal, her expression unreadable. The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. To my son Matthew, she began, her voice smooth, carrying just the right mix of pride and possession. May this year bring new adventures, strengthen bonds, and choices that honor the Hargrave name. Emma felt the words like a veiled command. Matthew's grip on her hand tightened, and she met his eyes, finding the strength she needed in his unwavering gaze. And to all of us, Victoria continued, her eyes sweeping over the guests and pausing briefly on Emma, may we find clarity in moments of uncertainty and hold fast to what we cherish most. The room erupted in applause, but underneath the polite clinking of glasses and congratulatory smiles, Emma sensed the wariness, the unspoken questions. Tonight was only the beginning. The toast concluded, and the guests resumed their mingling, but a current of tension still crackled beneath the surface. Emma felt it in every glance cast her way, every smile that was just a little too polite. Matthew stayed by her side, an anchor in the swirling sea of judgment and whispered speculation. Lauren, sensing the weight pressing down on her friend, leaned in with a conspiratorial grin. Emma, why don't we step outside for a breath of fresh air? You're starting to look like one of those Renaissance portraits where the subject's eyes follow you everywhere. Emma managed a laugh, grateful for the levity. Good idea. Matthew? He hesitated, glancing toward his mother, who was now engaged in a quiet conversation with Richard. I'll join you in a moment, he said, pressing a quick kiss to Emma's temple. I just need to take care of something. Emma nodded, the warmth of his gesture steadying her as she followed Lauren toward the terrace. The cool evening air was a welcome relief, the distant hum of Los Angeles below them grounding her in the reality outside the mansion's walls. Lauren leaned against the balustrade, her eyes sharp as she watched the party through the glass doors. Do you think Victoria's actually starting to accept you? She asked, her tone skeptical. Emma sighed, the question heavy in the air. I don't know. Tonight felt like a test, but it's hard to tell if I passed or if I just survived. Lauren's gaze softened, and she reached for Emma's hand. You belong here, no matter what anyone thinks. Matthew knows it, and you should too. Before Emma could respond, the glass doors opened, and Richard Coleman stepped out, a cigar in hand. His eyes flicked between the two women, a smile playing on his lips. Quite the night, isn't it? Emma straightened, feeling a prick of unease. Yes, it is, she replied, her tone careful. Richard exhaled a thin stream of smoke, the scent mingling with the cool breeze. I didn't mean to intrude, he said, though his presence felt deliberate. I just wanted to say, Emma, that you have a resilience I haven't seen in a long time. It reminds me of Matthew's father. Emma's brows furrowed, surprise flickering in her eyes. It was rare for anyone to speak of Matthew's father in front of Victoria, much less make comparisons. "Thank you," she said slowly. Richard's eyes, sharp and calculating, softened for a moment. He was a man who valued integrity over everything else, even when it cost him. He paused, his gaze turning toward the dark horizon. "I hope that you and Matthew remember that. The Hargrave name may be built on power, but its true legacy was always meant to be about something more." Lauren shifted uncomfortably, the conversation taking a turn she hadn't expected. Emma's pulse quickened, the words weaving an uneasy thread through her thoughts. Before she could respond, the doors opened again, and Victoria appeared, her expression unreadable. "Richard," she said, the single word carrying an unspoken warning. He smiled, tipping his head toward her. "Victoria, always a pleasure." He dropped the cigar into a nearby ashtray and walked past them, his steps echoing on the marble as he returned inside. Victoria's gaze moved to Emma, the silence between them charged. "A word, Emma?" Lauren's eyes darted between the two, her worry evident, but Emma nodded. "I'll be fine," she whispered, squeezing her friend's hand. Victoria gestured for Emma to follow her a few steps away, the night air cool against their skin. "You handled tonight better than I expected," Victoria said, her voice low, devoid of the biting edge Emma had come to expect. "Thank you," Emma said cautiously, searching Victoria's face for any hint of her true intentions. Victoria's eyes softened, if only for a moment. "I underestimated you. That won't happen again." Emma's breath caught, the statement layered with implications. It was not an admission of acceptance, but neither was it outright rejection. It was, perhaps, the closest Victoria had ever come to acknowledging Emma as an equal. Before Emma could respond, Matthew stepped onto the terrace, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "Mother, Emma, everything all right out here?" Victoria's mask slipped back into place, her smile practiced and cool. "Of course, Matthew. I was just getting to know Emma a little better." Matthew's eyes narrowed slightly, but he said nothing, slipping his arm around Emma's waist. The silent show of unity was not lost on Victoria. She nodded once, a subtle concession before turning to go back inside. The night felt different now, the tension still present but tempered by something new. A sense of progress, however tenuous. Emma looked up at Matthew, who met her gaze with a mixture of pride and relief. They had weathered the storm, but both knew that more challenges lay ahead. The Hargrave legacy was not easily changed, but tonight, for the first time, Emma felt that they might just stand a chance. The remaining hours of the night unfolded more quietly, the initial tension giving way to cautious acceptance. Guests drifted between conversations, some casting lingering glances at Emma and Matthew, others choosing to ignore the drama altogether. Emma felt the weight on her chest lessen with each passing moment. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, she felt a fragile truce had been established. Matthew kept his arm around her, guiding her through the final rounds of mingling. Each introduction felt less daunting, the whispers more distant as the night wore on. Lauren stayed nearby, her watchful eyes catching details that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Victoria remained a commanding presence, moving between guests with practiced elegance. She spoke with ease, her smile unwavering, but Emma noticed the subtle way she observed the room, eyes flicking to her son and his partner more often than before. It was as if Victoria was recalibrating, reassessing not just Emma, but the dynamics that tonight had unveiled. Richard Coleman, true to his enigmatic nature, seemed content to blend into the background, though his earlier words echoed in Emma's mind. The comparison to Matthew's father, a man Emma had only heard stories about, lingered, hinting at hidden depths and truths that the Hargrave family guarded fiercely. "Emma," a voice called softly, pulling her from her thoughts. It was an older woman with kind eyes and a simple, elegant dress. "I just wanted to say that I admire your courage tonight. Not everyone would face what you did with such grace." Emma's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. The woman nodded and moved on, but the warmth of the brief exchange remained. Matthew turned to her, a a smile breaking the tension that had settled between his brows. "See? You're winning them over." "I'm not sure if that's the right way to put it," Emma said, a wry smile touching her lips. "But I'll take it." They shared a quiet moment, the grandeur of the ballroom fading into the background as they stood together. Emma's eyes wandered to Victoria, who was watching them with an expression that was difficult to read. It wasn't disapproval, nor was it acceptance. It was something in between, a hint of curiosity and respect that hadn't been there before. The orchestra began its final set, a slow, sweeping piece that filled the room with an air of closure. Guests began to pair off, some for the last dance of the night, others for farewell conversations. Matthew took Emma's hand, drawing her close as they joined the dance floor one more time. "Are you ready for what comes next?" he asked, his voice low, only for her ears. Emma looked up at him, seeing the man who had stood by her, who had defied his world for her. She felt the strength in his touch, the promise in his eyes. "With you, yes," she said, the words carrying more certainty than she'd felt all night. As they swayed to the music, the world around them faded, and for a moment, it was just them. Victoria's gaze softened as she watched her son and Emma, a glimmer of realization dawning. She had always believed that power and legacy were built on control, on alliances and traditions. But maybe, just maybe, there was strength in allowing something new to take root, in recognizing that true legacy was not just in what you kept, but in what you embraced. The final notes of the waltz played out, and the room erupted in applause. Matthew and Emma stood together, the applause washing over them like a tide, a moment that felt like a victory not just for their love, but for everything they had fought for that night. Victoria stepped forward, raising her glass one last time. Her eyes met Emma's, and for the first time, there was no trace of coldness. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice steady, reaching through the distance between them. Emma's heart leapt as she lifted her glass in response, the echoes of the toast ringing with a hope she hadn't dared to believe in. This was just the start, but it was enough. They had claimed their place, not by fitting into the world of the Hargraves, but by showing that love, integrity, and resilience were what truly made them worthy. As the guests began to disperse, the city lights of Los Angeles flickered beyond the glass walls of the mansion, bearing silent witness to a night that would be remembered. Not for the opulence or the power plays, but for the moment a new chapter began in the Hargrave story, one where Emma's name was no longer a question, but a part of the answer. If you liked, consider subscribing to our channel and supporting us using the thanks button. Until next time.